Hey everybody, Nate here at WePrintWraps. Today I'm going to be taking you through how to output a completed design and get it set up into print-ready files. So as you can see on my screen here, I have a design that's been completed on a template for a Camaro. So I'm going to show you exactly how to take completed design and export ready-to-print PDF files. So this is a step where a lot of people get confused. Lots of times you get to this point where you have a completed design, as you see on screen here. Let's say you worked hard on this design, you know it's on a template, so everything is to scale. Your customer has approved the artwork, so everything's good there. But now when you want to actually print this, obviously if you were to just print this AI file as it is, it would basically just be printing out this proof, this template. So how do you actually separate the artwork from the template so that it's ready to print and that it is all measured out and paneled out for the different sections of the vehicle? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at today. So when we're done, we're going to have a handful of PDF files that look something like this. You can see there's 7 PDF files. Basically, they amount to driver's side, passenger side, front bumper, rear bumper, hood, roof, and trunk. And we're going to get all those files from this template file, but we're going to go through a few steps first. So our target here of what we're trying to do, I'll show you what we're going to work on here. First, we're going to create some panel boxes that look like this. And this is essentially just mapping out the different sections of the car and how we're going to want each section of the wrap to print. And during this section, we'll also be able to measure each of those panels so that we can be sure each of those panels is going to fit on the width of the printed material. And that way we can also confirm those measurements with the car. So for any measurements we're not sure of, we can compare our measurements on the template with the car. Then once that's done, then we're going to separate out the artwork from the template so that there's no more template lines left. All that's left is just the artwork, only the part that we want to print on the vinyl to install in the car, but it's sectioned out into those panels that we saw in the previous step. So how do we get to these steps here? Well, let's go back to our original design file here. So the way that we try to design is using a couple different layers here. You can see that I have 3 different layers. I have my design layer on bottom, I keep my template layer on top of that, and then a mask layer on top of that. Now I'm not going to go super in depth as to what those layers all mean or how I set them up, at least not in this video. But the main thing is to try to keep your design layer, your artwork layer, separate from your template layers, because that's going to make this whole process a lot easier. So if you haven't done that already, if all your artwork and your template is all on the same layer, I would suggest trying to go through your file and try to separate those into separate layers first. Then come back to this video and start playing from this point, and it'll make this whole process a lot easier. So now once you have those done in separate layers, I'm going to create another layer just for this part of the process. So right here, I'm going to create a new layer, my layers panel. I'm going to name this one Panels. And actually right now, I'm going to turn off the design layer. The reason why is because our panels are going to be based off of the actual sections of the car. So since this design has a lot of black in it, the black kind of hides the lines in the template, makes it a little bit hard to see. But if I turn off my design layer, now I can see all the template lines really easily, and that's going to make paneling out the different sections of the vehicle much easier. But we'll be able to turn that design layer back on later on when we're done, which is, again, why it helps to have that on a separate layer. So let me hide our layers window here. Make sure we're on the panels layer. Okay, and then hide it there. So now what I'm going to do is just use my rectangle tool. And really all we're going to be doing for this is just drawing a bunch of rectangles. One thing I should note is that this template is at 1/10 scale. So that's another thing you're going to want to make sure you know when you're doing this part of the process. Know what scale you're at. Now it doesn't matter what scale you are at. Lots of templates come at 1/20th scale. Lots of people prefer to work at 1/2 scale or 1/10 scale. And this process is the same for all those scales. You just want to make sure you know what scale you're working at before you start working. Now, I personally highly recommend working at 1/10 scale because we're going to have to be looking at a lot of measurements here. And when you're working at 1/10 scale, it makes measuring a lot easier. You're really only changing the placement of the decimal point with any measurements. And I'll show you more of what I mean by that as we go along. But so we're going to start out, we have a rectangle tool selected. And so let's just start out here with this passenger side. Let's make a selection of the entire passenger side. So what do I mean by that? So we want a rectangle that's going to cover the entire height of the car. And when I say the entire height of the car, I'm only talking about the painted surface. So I don't really care about the height of the wheels, only the height of the painted surfaces. So I started there at the top, come down here to the bottom, and then you want to go from front to back. But we're going to have separate sections for the front bumper and for the rear bumper. So we don't need to factor that into this passenger side section. So we really only want to come up to the furthest point of the front fender and the furthest point back of the rear quarter panel. So on the front, you can see that the front fender has this little point right here. This is why we want to see all the template lines as we're doing this. Just look for the furthest, most forward point in the fender, and every car is going to be different. This Camaro has a different shaped fender than most cars do. Usually the farthest point forward is going to be up by the headlight, but this one is right here. Then on the back, we want to do the same thing. Look for the furthest point that is not the bumper and that is not the trunk. The furthest point that is still the quarter panel. And so here you can see the quarter panel where it meets the bumper, follows this line up to the tail light. But then you can also see that the quarter panel extends a little bit further back above the taillight where it meets the trunk. So that point right there is actually our furthest back point on the quarter panel. And then on the top, it's pretty straightforward. Just look for the tallest point on the car. On the bottom, look for the bottommost point on the car. Again, not counting the wheels. We're just looking at the painted surfaces. So that would be that right there. Then I usually like to apply a stroke to this panel box, make it something that's really easy to see. It doesn't matter what color you use. I like to use 100% magenta. Again, it doesn't matter what color you use, just something that's going to be easy for you to see. And then I usually turn it up to like 3-point or so. That's going to depend on what scale you're working in, but in 10th scale, I think that makes a nice visible line that's easy to work with. So now we're going to go through and do that to the rest of the car. But before we do, I want to show you the next step in the process of what we would do after drawing that box. So we've drawn this box. It is exactly the size of the passenger side, right? So it stops exactly at the top, exactly at the bottom. It stops exactly at the front fender and exactly at the rear quarter panel, which isn't good. Usually during install, you're gonna need a little bit more vinyl, partly because to give a little wiggle room during installation, but also because these are three-dimensional surfaces. We're measuring them just two-dimensionally, but when you start factoring in all the curves that are on this car, like this quarter panel probably actually bulges out quite a bit. So that's going to take up a lot of extra material. So we need to give a little bit of extra material when we're printing to account for that, to make sure that the installer is going to have enough material to fully cover this section of the car, and then any excess will get trimmed off during installation. So what we recommend is 3 inches on all sides. So that would be 3 inches on top, 3 inches extra on bottom, 3 inches extra on front, 3 inches extra on the rear or the right section. So how do we do that? So since we have this box selected, again, I'm at 1/10 scale. And here's part of the reason why I like working at 1/10 scales, because now I can look up here at the dimensions of this box I have drawn. It tells me that this box is approximately 15.9 inches wide by 4.75 inches high. Now, since we're at 10th scale, the actual measurements of this panel would be if we just move this decimal point over by 1. So 15.9 inches actually amounts to 159 inches. 4.7 inches actually equates to 47 inches. So when we work in 10th scale, it makes it very easy to quickly look at these measurements and just mentally move that decimal point over, and we know what size this panel is. So if this panel is actually 159 inches by 47 inches, we want to add 3 inches on front, 3 inches on back, 3 inches on top, 3 inches on bottom. That means we actually need to add 6 inches to each of these dimensions. Again, because this is the width, so adding 3 inches on front and 3 inches on back would add 6 inches. Because this is the height, adding 3 inches on top and 3 inches on bottom would add 3 inches. So usually what I like to do is round these to the nearest number. So as you can see, this is actually 159.457 inches. Let's just get rid of that 457. So we're going to work at just 159 inches. And then our height, as you can see, is 47.503 inches. I'm going to round up to 48 inches, just to be safe. And now that we have that, it's easier for us to add 6 inches to each of these dimensions. So 159 plus 6 would be 165 inches. So since we're at 10th scale, I'm going to write that in as 116, or excuse me, it would write in as 16.6 inches. But again, because we're at 10th scale, that actually means 165 inches. Excuse me, I said 166. It's actually 165, which we're writing in 16.5, but in full scale that amounts to 165 inches. Okay, and then over here for our height, this says 4.8 inches, which again, in real size, that would be 48 inches. We want to add 6 inches to that, which would bring it up to 54 inches. Since we're in 10th scale, I'm going to write that as 5.4 inches. So now we have a panel measurement here that we know is going to be 165 inches by 54 inches. And that is going to be the dimension of the passenger side print file. That's going to be the dimension of the piece of vinyl that gets installed on the passenger side of the car. So now that we've seen how we do that, now usually what I like to do is go all the way around the car, add each of these boxes, and then usually I come back around at the end of it to add the bleed on everything. But I think we're going to do this as we go for each panel, just so you can get a little bit of practice and see how we do it for each of the different panels. So let's do this whole process again. This time we're going to do a little bit quicker on the driver's side. So again, we're using our rectangle tool. We're going to draw a box from the we want to find the furthest forward, furthest backward, furthest top, and furthest bottom point. So I'm starting here on the left with our most forward point on the fender. I'm going to draw a rectangle. I'm just going to look for the furthest point at the back of the car here. Again, it's that spot right above the taillight on this car. And then I just resize this box to go up to the top of the car. I'm going to resize it here to go down to that furthest bottom point there. Okay, and then so we have our initial box here. I'm going to go back to my direct select tool so I can select it and see the measurements up top. So this is about the same measurements we got on the other side. Now we just need to add 6 inches to each of these dimensions, and that's after rounding it to the nearest number. So if we remember from the other side, it was 165 inches long. Again, because this is 10 scale, I'm writing 16.5. And then the height was 54 inches high. But again, since this is 10 scale, I'm going to write that as 5.4 inches high. So here we go. Now we have driver and passenger side. Both of them are at 165 inches by 54 inches. So you can see you can select either one, and they are the same measurements. So it's always good to try to keep both sides symmetrical. It will help with install. That way, if they have any key measurements that they're aligning to, they know that once they do whatever they do for one side, they can do for the second side when they're installing. Now, one thing that happens a lot when we're resizing boxes is the stroke width changes. I always like to just kind of go back and set it to 3 point. That way, everything stays consistent and there's no distractions or anything while we're working on it. Okay, so next we're going to save the bumpers for last because those are actually a little bit tricky. So let's go on to the top view next. Now we're going to use this top view to get the hood, the roof, and the trunk. So let's start with the hood. Again, we're using our rectangle tool. We're looking for the furthest top point, furthest bottom point, furthest right point, and furthest left point. That's pretty straightforward with the hood, but that's the same process we did on the passenger and driver side. Once we have that box drawn, then we're going to just add the 3-inch bleed all the way around, so that amounts to 6 inches additional on the width and 6 inches additional on the height of that box. So up here I see I'm about 64 inches wide, so I'm going to add 6 inches to that and get 70 inches. So I'm going to write that as 7.0. On the height, I have about 53 inches. So I'm going to add 6 inches to that, which gives me 59 inches. I will write that as 5.9 inches. So now we know that our hood is 70 by 59 inches. Next, I'm going to come to the roof here. We're doing the same thing again. I still have my rectangle tool selected. I'm going to look for the farthest corners to the left and right, which is that right there, right by the windshield. So let's go out there to the right. I already have it on the left here. Now I need to look for the furthest top point, which is on the outside of that curve on the back windshield. Farthest bottom point, bring it down here to meet up with the windshield there. And now before adding bleed, this gives me approximately 48 inches by 58.5 inches. So 48 plus 6 is going to be 54 inches. I'll write that as 5.4. And then on the height, I'm going to round that up to 59 inches and then add 6, which gives me 65 inches. Now for the trunk. Now it gets a little bit tricky. For one, we have this spoiler blocking us. And then the other thing that's tricky about a trunk is that it doesn't all show on the top view. This trunk goes to here, but then it wraps down. And as you can see here on the side view, all we're seeing from the top view is from here to here. But then as you can see, the trunk also makes a curve and goes downwards. There's a vertical section of it here that we're not seeing in the top view. So here's what we do for something like that. I'm going to start out making a rectangle tool, making a rectangle with the rectangle tool like I did for all these other panels. I'm going to look for the furthest, the outermost points on all four sides. So here I have my bottom edge, I got my left edge, I got my right edge. Now on the top, I'm going to pull it all the way up here. And I think that that line all the way out there actually represents the bumper, not the trunk. I think the trunk actually is right here. So I'm going to count that as my furthest upper point here. But I know that there still needs to be a little bit more on this top section for it to be able to wrap down and go down this vertical section here on the rear. So how do I know how much extra to add on this top? Well, here we're going to switch over to this other view of the car. I'm going to make another rectangle just to measure this section. So I want to measure how far this vertical section of the trunk is here. So I'm going to make just another rectangle starting at the top of that vertical section down to the bottom of that vertical section where it meets the rear bumper. And now what I can do, let me reduce the stroke size a little bit on there so we can still see it a little easier. Now that I have that drawn, I'm going to just drag that over and butt it up with the top edge of this top view of the trunk. And then now that distance right there is how much extra needs to be on this edge of the trunk panel. Now I know that this trunk piece is the size of this upper section of the trunk plus this rear section of the trunk. So now I can delete that little extra guide that I made. And now this is our trunk dimension before bleed. So now we still want to add bleed to it. So we have, I'm going to call this 52 inches by 30 inches. We want to add 6 inches to the width. So 52 plus 6 is going to be 58 inches. 30 inches high plus 6 is going to be 36 inches. And that is our trunk. Excuse me. So now what I'm going to do is just kind of go back and give these all a consistent stroke width again. Again, I like 3 point. Now we're going to go to the bumpers. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, but we're going to use that same method we used to measure this trunk width as we're going to use that same method here to measure how big our bumpers need to be. Now bumpers are tricky because if we were to draw a rectangle just of what shows on, say, the front section here for the front bumper, it's deceptive because, as you know, most bumpers wrap around the sides of the car. And as you can see, it's not just the width of the car here, but it also needs to go back and meet up with this fender. So bumpers are all curved, and it makes it really hard to measure a curved surface when we're just looking at a two-dimensional template like this. So how do we make sure that we have enough on our bumper? So we're going to start out drawing a box like what I have here. So I just followed the same method. I looked for the 4 outermost points on all sides. So I found the topmost point here, bottommost point here, the point furthest to the right and furthest to the left here. But now we're going to want to pull this left and right side out further so that it's able to wrap around and go all the way to this corner here. But how do we know how much to do that? Well, like I said, we're going to use the same method we used on the trunk. I'm going to make an extra box as sort of a guide. So I'm going to start from this frontmost point of the bumper on the side view, and then draw a box that goes to the furthest point back. And that is how much extra I'm going to want to add on the sides of this bumper. Now if I move this box over and butt it up against the edge of this bumper here, now I know that that amount right there is how much extra I want to add to the bumper. And then I'll do the same for the other side. So now what I want to do is make sure that my bumper extends out to include that measurement there. And then on the left, do the same thing, make sure it includes that measurement there. I can now delete those temporary guides that I made. And this is my front bumper measurement. This gives me approximately 120 inches wide by 29 inches tall. Now we still want to add bleed to this as well. 3-inch bleed on all 4 sides is going to mean an extra 6 inches on the width and an extra 6 inches on the height. So we're going to go 126 inches wide by 35 inches tall. And then we're going to do the same thing again here on the back. So once again, back bumper, draw a box for your 4 outermost points. So there's my furthest left point, my furthest right point, and then I'm going to drag it up to the top of the bumper there, down to the bottom of the bumper. Again, this section of the trunk right here is already included in the panel we made over here. So we don't need to include this section in this back panel. We're only looking for the bumper. But again, this rear bumper, we know it's going to have to extend further out in this direction and in this direction in order for it to wrap around and cover this section of the bumper. So we're going to use that same method again that we used on the front bumper. Again, I have my rectangle tool selected. I'm just making a temporary box here that goes from the furthest back point of this rear bumper, and then draw a box and find the furthest forward point, which is that section right there where it meets the wheel well. And that is how much extra needs to be added on to the left and right side of the rear bumper. So I'm going to click and drag that over, make sure it meets up with the edge of this bumper panel. And then rather than duplicating this again and bringing it back over here and doing each side individually, quick little shortcut here is to, when you select this bumper and when you go to extend it out here, just hold the Alt key, or if you're on Mac, that would be the Option key, and do the same thing. But now when you do it, it's going to mirror it on the other side. So now we only had to do it on one side rather than both sides. It's just a little shortcut there. I'm going to delete that temporary box that we made. Here is our rear panel measurement, our rear bumper panel measurement. That is approximately 128 inches wide by, let's call it 23 inches tall. We're going to add 6, so that would be 128 plus 6 is 134 inches. 23 plus 6 would be 29 inches tall. Now once again, I'm going to go back through, just make sure I select all of my panel boxes, set them to a consistent stroke weight, 3-point. While I have them all selected, I'm also going to set this align stroke to inside. Now it's a small detail, but it'll actually help us out in one of the later steps. So these are all of my panel boxes. I have now completed all of the panel boxes. So once I do that, again, I select them all. I make sure they're all a consistent stroke weight, just so that there's no distractions. And then I set the align stroke function to inside. Okay, and there are my panel boxes. I can now turn my design layer back on. And now we are at that first step that I showed you here in the beginning. We now know exactly how each of our panels are going to section out. We know the dimensions that each of these panels are going to be. We know how many panels they're going to be. And so we're almost there now. Now all we need to do is separate the artwork from the template layers so that all that's left is just the artwork by itself, and that it fills up these panel boxes so that we can save them all as separate PDFs like we saw in the very beginning. So actually, before I do that, I'm going to save my progress here. So let me save here. I had this as Camaro Wing Library. I'm going to save this as Camaro Wing Library paneled. Oops. There we go. So now we don't lose the progress that we've made here. So now on this, what we're actually going to do is make artboards that correspond with each of these panel boxes that we've made. Sometimes for this step, it's actually easiest to turn off all of the layers except for the panels layer. That way, all we see is these boxes. And so what we're going to use now is the artboard tool, which is over here on the left. There it is, artboard tool. You can also use Shift-O to select it. Now, I'm going to open up this panels layer, and I'm going to go through and select them one by one, and then I'm going to align a new artboard to each one of these rectangles. So I'm going to start from the bottom. That is our passenger side panel. Now up here with the artboard tool selected, on the top it'll show me some of the tool options. So I'm going to click this plus button that makes a new artboard. Again, I have that rectangle selected for the passenger side. So with that selected, I'm going to come back up here to artboard, and this little drop-down window, I'm going to go to fit to selected art. And as you can see now, it's fit that artboard to our passenger side panel box. I'm now going to select the next box up, which was our driver side panel box. I'm going to now come up and make a new artboard, and then I'm going to go to the drop-down menu again, fit to selected art, and as you can see now, it's fit that artboard to our driver side panel box. Again, I'm doing all of this while having my artboard tool selected. Then I'm just coming to my layers panel, selecting the next panel, which is going to be our hood panel. I'm going to make a new artboard, fit to selected art. Then I'm going to go to the next panel, new artboard, fit to selected art. That was our roof. The next panel is our trunk, new artboard, fit to selected art. That's our trunk panel. Now we have our front bumper panel selected. I'm going to do new artboard, fit to selected art. And then we have an artboard for our front bumper. Then I'm going to select our rear bumper panel. And I'm going to do new artboard one more time, fit to selected art. And now I'm going to click out of our artboard tool. I'm going to go back to just our selection tool. And now we have an artboard that aligns to each of these panels, in addition to this overall artboard that we had from our template. So we can actually open up our artboards panel now. And here you can see that we have 8 artboards selected. Now we made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 print panels. So that 8th artboard is just this overall one. And that's actually our first one here. So we're going to go in reverse order then here. So now what I'm going to do is go into this artboards panel here, and name all of these artboards, because that's going to make it really easy for us to export these all as individual PDF files. So our first artboard was just this overall artboard that we had for our proof or our template. So I'm just going to name that artboard proof. And then our next one down, that was our passenger side artboard. The next one down was our driver side panel. The next one was our hood. Then we had our roof, our trunk. The next one was our front bumper. The next one was our rear bumper. Now that we have those all named, now we can turn on our other layers again. And actually, now we can turn off our panels layer. And we can see still that we have an artboard that equates to each of those rectangles that we made. That is going to be our print sizes. But now we need to separate this artwork from the template, because we don't want the template to print on these print panels. And of course, like in a section like this, on our driver's side, for example, we don't want this all to just be blank white area. We want that to be filled up with our design, so that's all usable extra there. So what we need to do is, first off, turn off our mask and our template layers, so we only have our design layer visible. Now, the way that I have this done, these are all in clipping masks, so I need to release these clipping masks, and I'm going to turn my panels layer back on, and I'm going to make a new clipping mask with those panel boxes that we used. So first off, select my artwork there, release that clipping mask. You can do so by selecting it, Control-Alt-7, which I believe is Command-Option-7 on a Mac. And so it releases that clipping mask, and now we can see that we have artwork that fills that entire print panel that we've made. But it actually goes a little bit too far and spills over into this rear bumper panel that we made, and we don't want that. So I'm going to select everything here. This includes the panel rectangle that I made, and I'm going to make a new clipping mask using that rectangle. So I'm going to press Control or Command 7, and it reduces it down to just that panel box size. I'm going to do the same thing for the passenger side. So select the artwork, release the clipping mask. That's Control-Alt-7 or Command-Option-7. Then I'm going to reselect everything, including the panel box, make a new clipping mask. That's Control-7 or Command-7. And I'm going to follow those same steps with all 7 of these panels here. So there's my rear bumper. I'm going to do it with my front bumper, and you're going to get to see a good example of an issue that we run into here. So when I undid this front view, again, I want it to fill up this entire panel space to make my front bumper panel. But when I undo the clipping mask that the artwork was in, you can see it doesn't fully cover that panel box. So if we were to print it like this, there would be a lot of dead white space on the vinyl, and the artwork might not fully cover that bumper. So we need to make sure we fill that in. So I'm going to actually just use my rectangle tool, make sure I have this black color selected, and then I am just going to block this out with solid black, because as you can see from this point over, really just needs to be solid black. And then here on the other side, I'm going to do the same thing. And so now those are blocked in as just solid black. That way the black will bleed all the way to the edges, and that front bumper piece will just have a lot of extra black that wraps around to the wheels. So now that I have that taken care of, I can select all of this. I'm going to do Control 7 or Command 7 to make my front bumper panel. Now I'm going to come to the top view, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select the artwork, release the clipping mask, reselect the artwork with the hood panel, and do a new clipping mask, which works. I now have a usable hood panel, but now I have nothing to use for the roof or the trunk panel. So I'm actually going to undo a couple of steps here. Let's go back. So actually what we need to do here is duplicate this artwork a couple of times. So I'm going to actually expand my design layer here. And I am going to click and drag this group that is my design, the top view design. If I just click, hold, and drag it into this little plus sign, it will duplicate it. And I'm going to duplicate it again. That way I have 3 copies of this top view design, and that will correspond with the 3 panels I have to make from the top view. So I'm going to select one of those clipping groups here, and then I'm going to hold Shift and also select my hood panel box. And then with those both selected, I'm going to release clipping mask, so Control Alt 7, Command Option 7. And now I'm going to just push Control 7 or Command 7 to make a new clipping mask, and that is now my hood piece. But you can see I still have another copy of the artwork here to make my roof piece. So I'm going to select my roof panel, and then I'm going to hold Shift and select the second copy of my top view artwork. I'm going to release clipping mask, and then I'm going to make a new clipping mask, and now I have a roof panel there. And as you can see, I still have one more duplicate of the top artwork available to use for my trunk. So I am going to release that clipping mask. And now we have one more issue here that we see. If you look here, the top view artwork does not completely extend all the way back to our trunk panel that we made. So we have a little bit of white here. We want to make sure that that's all filled in. So what I'm going to do is select everything there from my design panel. And since this doesn't have any critical lineups in this section, I'm just going to scoot everything up a little bit. Now with that all selected, make sure I select my trunk panel as well, make a new clipping mask, and there we have it. There is our trunk panel. So now I'm going to save this as a new file so that we don't lose our progress. I'm going to do Control Shift S or Command Shift S to save as, and I'm going to name this Print Panels. So now each one of these artboards is a print ready panel. We have our artwork separated off of the template. We know that it is the size that it needs to be for each of these corresponding sections of the car. And we now just need to save them into individual PDF files so that we can send them off to our printer. So to do that, as you can see, we've made artboards of all these different things, and that's going to help us out in this final step. Now we're going to come up here to File. We're going to do Export, Export for Screens. And then here there's a few steps we need to do. So we want to, this shows us each of the artboards and allows us to make selections for each artboard separately. So we want to select all artboards. We want to export PDFs as multiple files. So if you do single file, it's going to do just one PDF and make each of these artboards a separate page. We don't want that. We want separate PDF files, so multiple files. And then I actually lied. Instead of having all selected, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to deselect our proof artboard because we don't need that. That's not a print panel that we actually need to have printed out. So that automatically selects this range of 2 to 8. Then we want to make sure we just select where we want to save this. I'm going to create a folder that is called print files. And then let's put everything in there. Now you come down here to this format section. You want to make sure you have PDF selected. And then click on this little gearbox here for settings because you want to make sure you have a high quality PDF setting selected. So format settings, make sure you click down here on PDF, and then it will allow you to select one of your presets. Adobe Illustrator comes with this high quality print preset, and that'll work just fine for this one. So now we're going to do save settings. So again, we're checking which pages are exporting. We selected where to save it. We have multiple files selected. We're saving as PDF, and we went in and selected the high quality PDF preset. So now let's export those artboards. And now what it's doing is saving separate PDF files for each one of those artboards. And because we named our artboards, it's going to name each one of those PDFs with the name that we made that artboard. So this process takes just a couple minutes. Obviously, the more panels you have, the longer it's going to take. So let's just wait a minute while it does this. Okay, and it finished saving. So now we have, let's see, where did it save them? We have a print files folder here with 7 PDF files that correspond to each of those panel boxes that we made, each of the artboards that we made. You can see that it named each of the PDFs to correspond with the name of the artboard that we gave each. We can also open these up with Acrobat, and we can now see each of these panels on their own. So here is our passenger side. Here in Acrobat, we can hover on the bottom left and see our dimensions. Again, this was at 1/10 scale. So it says 16.5 by 5.4. Because this is 10 scale, that will actually print at 165 by 54 inches. We can go through, there's our front bumper, 126 by 35, our roof panel. Here's our rear bumper, our trunk, our hood, and our driver's side. And so everything looks good. One last thing that I would do so that everybody who works on these files will know that these are at 1/10 scale would be to just rename each of these files. So if you click on each one, just rename it. I'll usually put at the beginning in all caps 10th scale. And then I'll just copy and paste that into each of the other file names. Now when we send them off to print, our printer will also know that these are at 1/10 scale, and they'll know exactly how to print them. So to recap, again, we started out with a completed design that was on a template, and then what we did was we mapped out all of our panel boxes here. So for each section of the car, we figured out what size panel it took, and when we did that, remember we added 3 inches of extra on all 4 sides for each of these panels. We then, from there, got to this point where we had the artwork separated from the template with an artboard that matched each of those panels for each of the sections of the car. And then from here, we were able to export our print-ready files that are ready to send out for print. Once you have these files, you can send them off to WePrintWraps, and we can get them printed for you. You can use these files to upload on our website. You can use these files to calculate the square footage so you know how much material to order on our website. If you don't feel like doing the math to calculate the square footage from these files, just send these files over to WePrintWraps through an email. You can email hello@WePrintWraps.com. Let them know that you're looking to find out how much square footage is needed to print these files. They'll respond back to you with the amount of square footage and a link where you can order. Then you order on the website, and within 1 to 2 days, it'll ship out to you. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope this helped, and now you're all set up to export your completed designs into print-ready panels.